On Press Perspective today, we shed light on the latest screen productions on Netflix by Korea and of Korea that have been making headlines. Do stay with us. Hello, welcome to Press Perspective for this Friday, July 4th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Right, it's that time of the week yet again, during which we touch upon a series of stories related to South Korea that made international headlines in recent days. And today we shed light on screen productions and more. For this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, as always, welcome.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the pundit's take on today's topic. Colin, welcome back.
Glad to be with you.
Right, Thomas, we shall start with you. Let's begin with news about Squid Game Season 3 dominating global Netflix charts. Thomas.
That's right. Netflix released their weekly top 10 charts on Wednesday, and Squid Game Season 3 dominated, was #1 across all 93 countries that they record top 10 lists. And this was only over 3 days. It launched on a Friday, so it was like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 60.1 million viewers around the world over those few days. First time ever, I think, for a debut week that a series was #1 around the world. And it actually even boosted, brought Season 1 and Season 2 back to the top 10 list. Like Season 2 was, I think, #3, and Season 1 was #6 overall on this top 10 list. So, you know, the Squid Game global appeal continues. The first season is the most popular series of all time on Netflix, and I think the second one is close behind. So, it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, in an era when I think, we've seen content is so kind of fractured and balkanized, and there's so many places to watch things and so many different streamers. This is maybe one of the biggest kind of global single franchises that exists. And, in related to Korean content, I mean, if you had said this 10 years ago, probably even 5 years ago, that the biggest global hit by Netflix is a Korean language series, that's an original, not a franchise from an existing IP or something, it would have been quite a surprise, I think. So, it's obviously a testament to what Korean content makers have accomplished here. I mean, it's not a little bit of, I wouldn't be the first person to point out the irony and sort of the commercial success of a series that is so biting in its satire and about, the competition and the inequality of those capitalist society that we live in. And, Netflix itself has really capitalized on the commercial appeal. I mean, here in Seoul, there was a giant parade this weekend, there's a big fan event, and there's been tie-ins with, GS25, the convenience store has a Squid Game pop-up, and I think Shinsegae department store also has a Squid Game merchandise. So there's a little bit of irony there, and I think maybe in a bigger question, which we'll probably get into a little more, is, there's also, is such a dominant series and Netflix as such a dominant entity, also kind of reflecting the shifting inequality in the market. But in any case, still, it's you have to tip your hat to the success of Squid Game. Right,
for sure. Colin, another screen production on Netflix that's been making headlines is K-pop Demon Hunters that reportedly showcases various elements, that is, of the Korean culture, including its folklore. What impact does this inclusion have on the international audience, do you think?
Yes, K-pop Demon Hunters, which the title reminds me of this movie, a Hollywood movie that made a big stir about 20 years ago called Snakes on a Plane. Because of its straightforward title, everybody was talking about it. You want to see snakes on a plane? Watch Snakes on a Plane. You want to see K-pop Demon Hunters? Watch K-pop Demon Hunters. And I've watched it. I watched it last week. I'm a bit out of its demographic. This is a film obviously made for younger viewers. I'm about to become a father. If my daughter was sort of 12 and watching K-pop Demon Hunters, I'd be pretty happy that you could do a lot worse for animation for that age bracket, or for entertainment of any kind, for that matter. But yes, as you say, it draws on Korean history, it draws on Korean mythology and traditional religion. It's not all just about the present of K-pop. The Demon Hunters are a girl band, a trio, and they're fighting a boy band of demons, but one of the girls is part demon herself, and one of the demon boys, the Saja boys, the band is called, is a demon, but he's good-hearted, so they've got to come together to defeat this threat to humanity. And one of the most interesting parts of the movie to me was this montage at the beginning showing that the guardians of humanity have always been female singers or performers. Now it's a girl band. Before, in the 50s and 60s, it's like singing like sister trios like Korea had at that time. Before that, mudang doing their shamanistic rites, so it's this whole lineage. And this sounds like thoroughly Korean, but this is actually an American production, which surprised me. It's Sony Animation Studios. One of the directors, there were two, is Korean-American. She wanted to honor her heritage, and so it's very much the sensibility you would expect from that sentiment. She wants to bring in the traditional Korea she knows, and as well, it has a sort of a very Western sense of humor. So it's cross-cultural in many ways. And I think, when you look at there are these two animal characters, a gachi, a magpie, and a tiger. And they're prominent, and they become the most beloved parts of the movie, almost more so than the actual human or demon characters. If you go on social media, the tiger especially is celebrated. Derpy, I think they called him in the production. He has no name in the movie itself. But these are icons from minhwa, or folk art in Korea, a long tradition. It was the sort of non-aristocratic version of Korean art, but more robust for that. And these two icons, the gachi, the magpie, and the tiger, they sort of represent Korean culture in many ways. And they take this sort of lovable form in the film, and they've become, as I say, two breakout elements. But there's a lot there, a lot of paths one can trace if one has an interest in or curiosity about Korean traditional culture, but also it's the kind of movie that'll be most appreciated, I think, by people who, they like K-drama, they like K-pop, and they've maybe been to Korea a couple times. There's a lot of Easter eggs there. Oh, I know that Namsan Tower, I know that, oh, Ramyeon, I know, that's so Korean, oh my God. That's really the audience for this movie. And I think some of these viewers will follow these threads to learn more about traditional Korea, and I think they'll enjoy that. Some, of course, they're there for the songs, naturally.
And against this backdrop, Thomas, do you suppose it is now safe to perhaps say that K-entertainment has found itself a strong fan base within the global arena?
Yes, I think that question has probably been safe to say for quite a long time, actually. I think, the question, I was actually talking about this the other day, is almost like when we look back at this time period, how will we think of this as an era kind of culture, or will we call it something, this Korean culture era? Because clearly it's become so well established in, the forms that now, K-pop and K-dramas, but obviously we're seeing, maybe Happy Ending, a musical winning 6 Tony Awards, last month on Broadway. Han Kang winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. We're seeing a real cultural flourishing across, multiple areas. So I think, the question is more about how did this happen? How do we understand this, and maybe, where does it go from here? I think I remember when Gangnam Style came out, and it was Psy, and I think that moment was like, oh, it almost felt this is kind of a novelty or a one-off. Maybe it wasn't quite representative of what K-pop in general was, and maybe this will just be a passing fad. But then we saw, the emergence of BTS and multiple other groups, and the same thing with Squid Game is a huge hit, but there have been several K-drama hits before then, and across genres. It's not just one style. I mean, there's romance and comedy and horror and historical dramas, and so clearly something is going on where there's this ability to keep turning out content that the globe enjoys, and and I'm curious to really kind of explore or think about how is that happening, why is that happening? I mean, some of the conditions are just, I think, material conditions about investment and film schools and things. And I think there's also a sense of, every artistic movement or scene comes with a sense of community, and there's so many people that are creating work now that I think that feeds off of, one another and creates competition. So there's some elements of that. And I think, as well, I guess the question is, do you become a victim of your own success in some ways? Will things become over-commercialized? Will smaller independent voices kind of get muscled out of the conversation? So I think those are some of the bigger questions. But as far as whether Korean culture has a global fan base, I think that is, unequivocally been answered for sure.
Right. Thomas, I wonder, do you suppose that Korean interest in Korean pop culture is perhaps also expanding to include its traditional culture? The reason I ask is because findings as of the first half of this year reportedly show 2.7 million people visited the National Museum of Korea. That's the highest in 20 years, apparently.
Yes, that's right. I was reading about this, and that it was an increase of 64% over last year. And actually, the media articles that covered it here, speaking to some of the museum officials, they directly connected it to this interest in, Korean traditional culture being integrated into popular culture, and specifically mentioned K-pop Demon Hunter as one of the big driving factors. And they had actually talked about, there's also another element of commercialization and merchandising, where they said the sales of merchandise has also gone up quite a bit, and they've been quick to pick up on, as Colin was mentioning, the character of the tiger and the magpie. They've said sales of those items, there's like a badge or something that they sell there, has skyrocketed, and also the gat, like the Korean traditional men's hat, there's like a ballpoint pen with a hat on it, and that has also gone up quite a bit. So they're directly actually mentioned the K-pop Demon Hunter, and they also were talking about a dance competition, that show called World of Street Woman Fighter that's going on. That's a modern dance show, but I guess they did a challenge recently that incorporated traditional elements, and it went very viral online, and they said that's another thing. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely another facet that is growing in this overall popular culture
Right.
world.
And speaking about this growing interest in K-content overseas, Colin, amid the growing interest that is, there have reportedly been some false claims over Korean culture. Do you suppose the growing presence of K-content on the international arena could perhaps serve to promote better understanding about the Korean culture and history?
It certainly can stoke an interest in it. And when I meet people who are here, foreigners who are here for the first time in Korea, I often talk to them about this. I tell them to keep in mind this question of, to what extent is South Korea this 5,000-year-old society, and to what extent is it a less than 80-year-old society connecting itself to its distant past? Both are true in different proportions, in different ways. We talk about K-pop Demon Hunters. This is a good example of the present, the sort of cutting-edge K-pop culture being connected to the distant past, the mythological past in some senses. So you have these two ends of the historical spectrum. Where it gets tricky is in the middle. How exactly does that narrative work? How does the present actually connect to that past in a continuous way? I talk to teachers here who say, their students, they know individual episodes of Korean history. They have a very hard time describing the narrative of Korean history, no matter in how broad strokes it may be. So I think when it comes to understanding Korean culture, being able to evaluate these claims for yourself, Korean or any other culture, you do need an understanding of history, and you need to really know how one chapter really does follow another, rather than just knowing the mythology, the old sort of glorious episodes of the past, and knowing the present. You really have to understand what comes in the middle, which here in Korea can be very contested and can be seen as a battleground because it affects the legitimacy of the regime now, or the regimes that have existed. So you really need to think of, what's every step that's taken Korea from the past to its present. Really think clearly about that and get as clear an understanding as you can. And then, you'll be better equipped to evaluate when there are claims made about Korean culture, to just understand why those claims are being made and in whose interest they might be. But it's not easy, and it takes some serious scholarship in some cases.
Right, it really isn't easy. Thomas, moving forward, Parasite, it's been picked as the #1 movie for the 21st century by the New York Times. That being said, what do you suppose would serve to keep the K-content, if you will, above the test of time? What trait will keep it above?
Well, as far as Parasite goes, I was chatting with Colin about this before the show. We were both, I wouldn't say shocked, but I was surprised to see that it was the #1 film, not because I didn't think it was a great film, but obviously there's a lot of challenge, other excellent work. But I think, Parasite did seem to capture something in the zeitgeist that really resonated. And in a similar way, I would say Squid Game also captured something that just spoke to people. They, different, obviously they're both different approaches, but, they did speak to this sense of people just feeling, the challenges and being put upon by the struggling to survive in an increasingly, predatory and competitive and unequal society. I mean, they both spoke to that in a way that clearly the world related to. And I mean, as far as that aspect of it, I think, I was thinking about how, maybe South Korea is uniquely positioned in a way to comment about that. Just if you look at its own recent history of coming from, just how rapidly it developed economically, coming from, in living memory, it was a poor country for a lot of people to becoming this incredibly, successful and economically wealthy country, and, but yet creating inequality along the way. I mean, even just the move from, a dictatorship to democracy, there's been these wild swings of just social upheaval in the 90s and economic sort of crisis, so I think there's something in the atmosphere of Korean culture that maybe gives people this perspective where you can almost see things from the high and low in such a clear way. But beyond that, they both also found success by taking these topics on, but doing it with humor, satire, kind of panache. And I mean, that's just something that also speaks to the success, I think, of other content where, and where that comes from, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but, I think both series, they blend so many genres, they have elements of horror, humor, satire, and I think a lot of successful K content also does that well. K-pop is often considered this kind of blender of a lot of different styles, and a lot of series that have been successful have had that kind of, what was The Kingdom or something, it's like history and zombies, and I think there's always an element of that that's, somehow brought into bear. So I mean, there's some combination of just, again, like a system that enables people to create this type of content. People also are not being stopped from making it. When you look at authoritarian countries that don't, allow freedom of expression, so you don't see things like this coming out of a China or a Russia. So that's part of it, that there's an openness, and there has been an investment and a promotion of culture, so that's kept it going. And I think, the entire cultural marketplace itself has just, continued to foment. So, I mean, a lot of elements, but I just think in some ways Korea itself is a kind of a concentrated version of so many things that the contemporary world is going through, that it has almost a special perspective on it.
Right, and staying with Korea's content market, if you will, Colin, this is something that Thomas alluded to very briefly at the start of our talk. Some say the presence of streaming services like Netflix are both a blessing and a burden. What are your thoughts?
Yes, it's true. Netflix, apart from, say, YouTube, has got to be the main channel through which foreigners are accessing or receiving Korean popular culture. As Thomas mentioned, Squid Game is very popular on Netflix, maybe the most popular production of any kind on there. I think it's #1 taken as a whole, although it's hard not to notice, even if you haven't watched the 2 succeeding seasons of Squid Game, that the critical evaluations have been falling steadily. And that may owe to the fact that Korean dramas originally were not produced in seasons at all. This is a structure we're used to in US television and Netflix. The Netflix model is like, you release a season of a show. If that does well, you do season 2, season 3. And oftentimes, yes, whatever countries the show comes from, they do decline season on season. But here in Korea, and there was a good discussion of this, an insightful discussion in the book Pop City by a researcher named Oh Yu-jong, I think her name is, how Korean dramas were once produced in real time, essentially, in response to audience demands. So if the audience liked some particular character, the show might actually change to be about that character. Episodes would be written in part the day of broadcast, sometimes it's still being shot. So that had downsides too. But now with the Netflix model, you've got to make the season, see how it lands. Maybe you make another one, maybe you don't. But in the case of Squid Game Season 2, There's also been Netflix scale, Netflix budgets. In that series, I think each episode cost something like $9.8 million to make, which was not the case with the Korean dramas of old. So you do get a sense the weight of the scale of production might be getting to be a bit much. That has to be justified by finding a large audience outside Korea, of course. And so the engineering you get, that whether it be narrative or in other aspects of the production, is we've got to appeal to foreigners. And it moves ever so steadily away from what made Korean dramas interesting, which was that they were geared toward Korean audiences. So Squid Game is still successful. People are watching the third season. By any standard, it's succeeding, but I wonder if you do look at this, you can see, if you look closely, the golden goose being killed in a way, or a threat in any case to the life of the golden goose. You know, Korean content, I hate that word, but Korean content is successful for a reason. And if you make it less Korean in search of a wider audience to justify the budgets, to justify the scale, there is a certain risk there.
Right. Thomas, speaking as a foreign correspondent based here in South Korea, would you say there's been a rise in the number of requests for stories related to Korean content, the word that Colin does not like too much, Korean culture or K entertainment, if you will?
Sure. I mean, just out of the sense that, you know, no one wants to miss out on something. I mean, I think there's always a sense of editors wondering what's happening, you know, and there's just so much more going on. I mean, it's not like the days of, you know, it was a novelty or you know, it was unusual to just report about, oh, this, you know, this one show or this one band. I mean, it's so saturated in global culture that, yeah, so the angle, I think the angles are different now too. I mean, they're more specific, and I think the amount of coverage here, just in general, there's so many more pieces. You know, there are more journalists based here, or newsrooms here, and you know, so they'll just be every day. I feel like I'm seeing something that's just about a little niche trend in South Korea that, you know, wouldn't have been picked up just because there wouldn't have been the people on the ground here. So I mean, I think it's just overall, yeah, absolutely. It's you know, it's more and it's multifaceted and it's more specific. You know.
Right, for sure. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. We'll have to end here. Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Colin, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, and for those of our viewers who have yet to watch K-pop Demon Hunters and Squid Game Season 3, please do so this weekend. That's all for this week. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend and see you next time.